A folded intake form nobody has finished reading sits on the front counter, and the dog behind the last kennel door has already been given a date. He's signing for run 14, the younger volunteer said, low, from behind the counter, watching the old man's pen move across the visitor log in strokes so slow they looked deliberate rather than shaky. The dangerous one. The other volunteer, older by maybe a decade, didn't look up from the crate she was labeling. Bless his heart. Somebody should tell him. Tell him what? That rook took a chunk out of a vet tech's sleeve in March, and the tech still won't come back on Thursdays. She set the crate down. That man's gotta be 80. 70-something, the younger one said, though she had no way of knowing, and something about the old man's stillness at the counter made guessing at him feel rude, like speaking too loud in a church. He wore a canvas coat gone soft at the collar, and he held it closed with one hand, though the room was warm. He did not look at either of them. He looked at the log, and at the pen, and at the door beyond the counter, with the frosted glass and the schedule taped to it. If you have ever been written off by a number on a form, instead of the truth of you, you already know what happens in the next 5 minutes. Behind the frosted glass, Priya Northcott had the phone wedged against her shoulder and a legal pad covered in her own handwriting. 3 different pens worth, each one crossing out what the last one swore was final. I understand the visit's been moved, she said, to someone in the state office 2 counties over, in the voice she used for people who outranked her. I'm asking for confirmation of the date, that's all I need today. She caught the shape of the old man through the glass, a stooped silhouette in a coat too heavy for the season, and covered the receiver with her palm long enough to call through the half-open door. Whoever that is for 14, give him his 5 minutes. I want him gone before the mock walkthrough. Then, back into the phone, brisk again, already moving past him in her mind, the way a woman moves past a chair she does not intend to sit in. No, we're prepared. We've got nothing on the books we can't account for. The intake paperwork on the counter did not know it was being discussed. It sat where Harlow Fenno had left it that morning, unfinished, a euthanasia date typed into a field in the lower third of the page, 5 days out, waiting on a signature nobody wanted to be the one to give. The old man signed his own name below the visitor line in the same unhurried hand, folded the pen shut with 2 fingers, and did not once glance at the frosted glass, though he had heard every word of it, and though the room, without knowing it yet, had just met the only person in it who understood exactly what a form could not measure. He was called Garland Ammons on that log, and nowhere else in the building did his name mean anything at all, not yet. He came through the intake area the way a man crosses a floor he has crossed before, weight settling into each step before the next one started, and if you watched only his face, you would think him unremarkable. 74 years worn plainly, a jaw gone soft at the edges, eyes pale and patient under brows gone the color of ash. It was his left shoulder that told the truer story, if you knew to look. It sat higher than the right, fixed there, so that when he needed to reach for anything across his body, he turned the whole trunk of himself rather than force the arm, a small and total economy that had clearly been earned somewhere and paid for since. The canvas barn coat he wore was patched at both elbows, thread a shade darker than the fabric, the kind of mending done by someone who valued the coat more than he minded the mismatch. Underneath it, a collared shirt was buttoned to the throat, as though he had dressed that morning for something more formal than a shelter visit, and then thought better of the tie. He carried a canvas bag over the good shoulder, and inside it, wrapped in a dish towel gone thin from washing, was a length of leather tugging gear he had stitched himself some 30 years back, a roll of hide folded and cross-stitched in a pattern only he would recognize as his own private tolerance, tight where the stress would fall, looser where a dog's teeth needed give. A metal tag was threaded onto its pull cord, small, worn smooth at the edges, the stamped letters on it no longer readable to anyone but him. He did not go straight to run 14. Halfway down the corridor, past a run standing empty with its gate latched and its water bowl turned upside down and dry, he stopped. He set 2 fingers against the chain link, not gripping it, just resting there, and held them for 3 full seconds, no more, no less, as though counting something only he kept track of, before he continued on, and nothing in his face when he moved away explained what had just happened, or why an empty kennel deserved that kind of attention from a man who'd never once been told a dog had lived there. Harlow Fenno saw it from the wash station, a bucket sweating cold water against her knee, and filed it the way she filed most things about that morning, unexplained and probably important. She was 26, 2 years into the job, young enough that the older staff still called her new, without meaning anything unkind by it, and she had spent most of that morning failing, again, to keep Rook's name off a list. She'd rewritten his intake summary twice, softened unprovoked aggression to situational reactivity, cause undetermined, and watched Northcott's red pen restore the original language within the hour. She'd asked, twice, whether anyone had cross-referenced the incident log against the shift schedule, and been told, twice, that the schedule wasn't the kind of variable the assessment tracked. She kept a folder of her own in the bottom drawer of the intake desk, printouts of Rook's service record before the county ever had him, deployment dates, a citation for locating 2 wounded men under fire, a handler's name blacked out per privacy policy. And she had shown that folder to exactly no one, because she suspected showing it would only speed up the ending she was trying to prevent. She watched the old man's fingers leave the chain link and thought, without being able to say why, that he had just done something with the weight of a small ceremony, performed for no audience, meant to be seen by no one. Northcott came out from behind the glass with her legal pad still in hand and a laminated card clipped to her belt loop, catching light each time she turned, and fell into step beside Garland, with the easy authority of someone walking a building she owned, in every sense but the deed. "Mr. Ammons," she said, reading his name off a clipboard rather than the log, though she'd watched him write it herself. "I appreciate you coming in, but I want to be upfront about what you're going to see." She unclipped the laminated card without looking at it, because she'd long since memorized every line on it and read from it anyway, in the voice she'd built for state auditors and worried families alike. Run 14 is a Category 3, behavioral hold, score of 8 out of 10 on unprovoked reactivity, 4 recorded incidents in 90 days, most recent laceration requiring 6 stitches. She said laceration, the way some people said scripture, each syllable placed with care. A knot of staff had gathered without quite meaning to, a kennel tech drying her hands on her jeans, 2 volunteers who'd abandoned their crates, Harlow hanging back near the wash station with her arms folded. Someone near the back, a volunteer barely into his 20s, grinned and stage whispered to the tech beside him, "We should sell tickets. Watch Grandpa go 14 rounds with 14. A ripple of laughter went through the group, quick and a little ashamed of itself, even as it happened. Garland did not turn toward the joke. He looked at the corkboard schedule on the wall instead, at the shift change times printed on it in a font too small for the distance, and said, in a voice that carried no more weight than a man remarking on weather, "A dog that bites on a schedule isn't unprovoked. He's answering something." The laughter stopped the way a held breath stops, not silenced, just spent, the air gone out of it before anyone decided to let it go. Northcott's mouth opened to continue reading, and found, for one full second, that she had lost her place on the card. He did not enter Run 14, not yet. He set his canvas bag down outside the mesh gate and stood with his good shoulder against the concrete block wall, and there he stayed for the better part of an hour, watching the way another man might watch weather come in over a field, patient, unbothered by the wait itself, reading something the rest of the building had stopped trying to read months ago. He watched Rook's ears first. They rode forward and loose most of the time, tracking footsteps down the corridor with the mild curiosity of any dog bored in a kennel, swiveling toward Harlow when she passed with the mop bucket, toward a volunteer's radio crackling 2 runs down. He watched the dog's weight next, how it rode back on the haunches in relaxed hours and crept forward onto the front paws, low and gathering, at specific ones. He watched the ribs. A calm dog breathes in a rhythm you could set a watch to. Rook's rhythm held steady through the late morning, through the noise of the wash station, through a delivery truck backing in outside with its alarm chirping. None of it moved him. Garland noted this against the clock on the wall behind the counter, not against the calendar taped beside it, because the calendar was where the shelter kept its dates, and the clock was where the truth was. At 11:40, the ribs changed. It came on slow enough that a person watching the dog and not the room might have missed it, a tightening through the chest, the ears swiveling flat and then locking toward the corridor's far end, the front paws creeping another half-inch under the body. At 11:41, the wall-mounted intercom gave its shift-change chime, 3 short tones, through a speaker with a blown tweeter, tinny, and half-swallowed by static, the kind of sound a building makes 100 times a week, without anyone hearing it as anything but furniture. Rook came up off his haunches like something released. Garland did not move. He watched the whole of it, the coiled charge across the run, the bark that came out closer to a scream than a warning, the way the dog worked the corner of the kennel nearest the door, as though there were something there to drive back, rather than nothing at all. And when it settled, 4 minutes later, he looked again at the clock, and then at the intercom speaker, and said nothing to anyone, because there was no one beside him yet to say it to. Harlow found him there at noon, clipboard against her chest, and said, before she'd fully decided to, "It's always around then, 11:40, give or take. I noticed it back in June and put it in a note, and operations said it wasn't statistically significant," Garland said, finishing it for her. Not unkindly, the way a man finishes a sentence he has heard finished wrong 100 times before. Machines call it noise when they don't know what it's an echo of. She looked at him for a long moment, the way you look at someone who has just said the thing you'd been circling for weeks without landing on the words. You think it's the chime. "I think," he said, and stopped there, because that was as far as a man like him went, on a guess he hadn't yet proven. "I'd like to go in and find out." He went in 20 minutes later, alone, over Northcott's flat refusal, walked back once Harlow reminded her the county's own waiver covered exactly this kind of supervised behavioral visit, in writing, filed the year before. Northcott stood at the mesh with her laminated card raised in one hand, already composing, in her head, the line she'd use to close this out for the record. Garland set his canvas bag inside the gate, lowered himself to the concrete with the slow, total body care of a man whose knees had opinions about it, and sat with his back to the dog. He did not speak. He unwrapped the dish towel and set the stitch tug roll on the floor beside his hip, the worn tag on its cord catching the fluorescent light once before settling still, and then he simply breathed, in a rhythm anyone counting could have set a watch to, and waited. 2 minutes passed. Rook held the far corner, weight low, a growl running under his breath like an engine idling. 3 minutes. The growl thinned. At 11:40, on schedule, exact enough that Harlow's own breath caught watching the wall clock over the mesh, the intercom gave its 3 tones, and Rook's whole body gathered to do what it had done every day for months. Garland's stillness did not break. He did not turn, did not brace, did not so much as shift his weight off the hip he'd settled it onto, and the tug roll, warmed now by the concrete and by his hand having rested near it, gave up its old scent into air already carrying his own, unhurried breathing, and something in the dog's gathered charge lost its target halfway through the leap it hadn't yet taken. Rook came down instead of forward. He crossed the run low, slow, stopped a foot from Garland's back, and pressed his full weight down against the old man's leg, the way water finds a low place to lie, not asked to, not commanded to, simply arriving there because there was, for the first time in that hour on that day, somewhere safe to arrive. Northcott's laminated card stayed raised in her hand at the mesh, her mouth open on whatever sentence she'd meant to read next, and she did not read it. She stood there, gripping a card full of numbers, watching a dog she had scored an 8 out of 10 lie down against a stranger, and for the length of that silence, she could not find one word on her own list that accounted for it. The audit moved up 3 days before Northcott had even finished drafting her plan for the original date, an email from the state office landing at 4 that afternoon with a subject line that made her stomach drop before she'd read past the first sentence. Site visit, Thursday. Full facility review including all Category 3 holds. She read it twice, standing in the corridor outside her own office, and did the arithmetic without wanting to. 5 days had just become 2, and Rook was still, on paper, an unresolved high-risk case with a euthanasia date sitting a week out that the assessors would now walk in and find pending, rather than closed. Her assistant director called before she'd finished reading the email a third time. She didn't need to guess what he wanted. She'd worked under him 3 years and knew the particular patience in his voice for what it was, a patience that meant he'd already decided the outcome and was only waiting for her to arrive at it herself. "Clean books before Thursday," he said. "Every high-risk hold resolved one way or the other." "You know what resolved means, Priya. I don't have to spell it." "There's an adoption interest forming on 14, she said, and heard how thin it sounded even as she said it. An old man's 5 minutes on a concrete floor, no application filed, no home check scheduled, nothing you could put in a column. Then file it or close it. Don't leave me a case in limbo when a state assessor's standing in that kennel." He hung up before she could answer, and she stood there with the phone still warm against her ear, aware that the version of this story where she simply did her job was also, unmistakably, the version where a dog who'd finally gone quiet for the first time in months would not live to see the following week. Harlow tried to buy time the only way she had. She flagged Rook's file for a 72-hour administrative hold, the kind of routine delay used a dozen times a year for paperwork snags, and backdated nothing, changed nothing that wasn't hers to change. It bought less than a day. Northcott's assistant director found the flag by Wednesday morning, traced it to Harlow's login, and had her sitting across a desk from him within the hour, a formal write-up sliding across the desk in a manila folder that felt, to her, heavier than its 2 pages should have. "Insubordination's a strong word for a hold flag," she said. "It's the word on the form," he said, and did not look up from it. Garland arrived that same morning to find a laminated notice taped fresh to the intake counter. "Visitor access to Category 3 holds suspended pending liability review." Dated that day. Signed by Northcott, under pressure he could see plainly enough in the tightness around her eyes, even before Harlow, red-faced and furious on his behalf, explained what had happened overnight. He read the notice once, top to bottom, the way he'd have read a repair order he disagreed with, and said only, "I understand policy," in a voice that gave nothing else away, though his hand, when he set his canvas bag down on the counter, rested there a moment longer than it needed to. Colonel Delbert Juergen's phone call came in at 9 that morning, placed on Garland's behalf, though not at his asking. Harlow had found the old service record in her bottom drawer, and out of options, out of time, called the one contact number listed on a decades-old citation and hoped. Juergen, 69 now, retired from a command he'd held decades before, still sat on the volunteer board of the Regional Veterans K-9 Placement Charity that partnered with counties like this one, and he made the call he thought would settle it in one sentence. "I'd consider it a personal favor if you'd expedite the Ammon's adoption," he told Northcott's assistant director, in the voice of a man used to requests functioning as instructions. It did the opposite of what he intended. The assistant director logged the call within the hour, as an attempted influence on an active behavioral case, forwarded a note to Northcott flagging board-adjacent pressure to bypass standard review, and the effect on her was immediate and hardening. She'd spent 3 days being told to clean her books, and now a colonel's phone call looked, on paper, like exactly the kind of irregularity a state auditor would flag her department for tolerating. She told Harlow flatly that the call had made things worse, not better, and she meant it. It was reviewing that same flagged note, late that afternoon, cross-referencing the assistant director's memo against the case file to make sure her own paperwork was airtight before Thursday, that she found the other document. It had been misfiled behind Rook's intake photos for months, a scanned agreement 3 years old, a bulk sale contract between the county shelter system and a private broker of decommissioned training equipment, dogs listed by intake number rather than name, behavioral washout, Category 3, a price per animal that made her read it twice, to be sure she wasn't misreading a decimal. Rook's intake number was on the list, so were 2 others still in the building. The signature authorizing it, dated 3 years back, long before Priya Northcott had ever taken the job, was her own assistant director's. She sat with that for a long moment in the quiet of her office, the laminated card still clipped uselessly to her belt loop, and understood, with a clarity that made her slightly sick, that she had spent 5 days enforcing someone else's arrangement and calling it an audit. She found Garland in the corridor near the front counter the next morning, waiting without complaint beside a canvas bag he'd been made to leave outside the restricted gate for 2 straight days, and it was Colonel Jurgen, driven out that morning himself, uninvited, unwilling to let a phone call be the last thing he did on this, who asked the question in front of the gathered staff, Harlow included, her write-up still sitting unresolved in a folder somewhere upstairs. "Tell them how you knew," Jurgen said to Garland, plain as an order, though there was nothing military left in his voice, only an old friend's patience. "Tell them what you heard in there, that their machines didn't." Garland set his bag down and did not reach for anything in it. He looked at the group the way he'd looked at the empty run days before, not performing, simply arriving at something owed. "I handled dogs for the Corps 22 years, he said, enlisted at 19, came out at 41, and every year since has been 33 of them now, which is arithmetic, not a war story, so don't mistake it for one." He let that settle before he went on. "I had a dog once, name of Sorrel, 2 tours together. She's been in the ground behind my shop 19 years, and there hasn't been a week since where I haven't thought of her before I thought of most people I know." He did not dress the sentence up further than that, and no one in the room asked him to. "The chime in there," he said, and here his voice did not rise, did not perform, simply laid the fact down the way he'd lay a tool on a bench, carries a pattern close enough to overseas intercom traffic that a dog trained to that traffic will answer it the same way, every time, whether the danger's real or 19 years gone. Rook's handler was hurt bad enough to end his own service near equipment that made that exact 3-tone pattern. That dog's not broken. He's been reliving a radio call nobody in this building ever heard the first time. He looked, briefly, toward the corkboard schedule on the wall, the shift times printed too small for most people to bother reading. "I didn't come here for a training record correcting anyone's opinion of me. I came to ask you to move a radio." The line landed in the room the way a held breath finally lets go. No one spoke for the length of several seconds, and Northcott, laminated card still in her hand, looked down at it as though seeing, for the first time, what it had never once measured. "That's all," Garland said. "Move the intercom schedule so it doesn't chime during his exercise hours, and let the paperwork say what actually happened to him instead of what was easiest to write down." Northcott did not wait for her assistant director's approval. She filed the correction herself that same afternoon, struck "unprovoked aggression, cause undetermined," from Rook's record, and replaced it with 4 lines describing a conditioned trauma response to a specific auditory pattern, cross-reference to his overseas service file, and beneath it she wrote a new departmental note, one that would outlast her own tenure there. Incident logs must cross-reference facility schedule and equipment audio before classification as unprovoked. She signed it with her full name, not her initials, and did not clip the laminated card back to her belt when she was done. 6 weeks later, the workshop behind Garland Ammons's house held the particular quiet of a place with work still left in it. A neighbor's kennel gate laid across 2 sawhorses, hinge pins soaking loose in a coffee can of penetrating oil. A radio on the shelf turned down low enough to be company rather than noise. Rook lay against the leg of a chair near the door, the chair no longer empty in the way it had been for 19 years, and the dog's breathing kept the same easy rhythm Garland had first taught himself to read off him weeks before, steady enough now to set a watch to on any hour of any day. The stitched tug roll hung from a nail just inside the workshop door, dish towel long since retired to a drawer, Rook's old service tag still threaded through its worn pull cord, catching the same fluorescent light in a different room. Garland worked the gate's hinge with 2 fingers of a hand that had stitched that roll 30 years back, turning his whole trunk rather than reaching across the shoulder that had never once forgiven him for the reach, and somewhere down the fence line behind the shop, underground, he still walked past most mornings without needing to stop there anymore. Another dog's name kept its own quiet account of 19 years. "Tell us about the animal, or the person, that a system gave up on too soon." The gate hinge turned free at last, easy on its pin, and Rook, hearing it, did not lift his head from the floor, only opened one eye toward the sound, satisfied it belonged to a hand he already knew, before letting it close again.